You think you understand how the universe will end. You don't. You imagine a final catastrophe, a last explosion, a collapse, a dramatic silence after motion ceases. This confidence comes from treating the universe as a story with an ending, something that builds toward a conclusion because everything familiar does. Lives end, fires burn out, machines fail. You extend this pattern outward and assume the cosmos must obey the same logic. That assumption feels unavoidable. It is also false. Your intuition begins with a quiet certainty that the universe exists in time, evolves through time, and will therefore conclude in time. From this, you picture an ending as an event that happens to the universe, something it reaches, something it experiences. But the universe is not a character moving through a timeline. Time is not a river carrying the cosmos forward. Time is part of the structure that defines what the universe is allowed to be. Once this is understood, the idea of an ending begins to fracture. Discomfort appears when you realize that asking how the universe will end already assumes too much. It assumes that there will be a final state that can be compared to earlier ones. It assumes that change continues all the way to the end. It assumes that the language of will remains valid indefinitely. None of these assumptions are guaranteed by the structure of reality. They are inherited from your experience of change, not from the universe's obligations. You may still believe that the universe must meet a physical fate: heat, death, collapse, disintegration. These possibilities feel concrete because they resemble processes you recognize. Energy spreads out, systems decay, structures fail. This line of thinking is persuasive because it is grounded in familiar laws. But those laws operate within time, under conditions where time functions as an ordering dimension. They describe what happens as long as happening remains a meaningful concept. The contradiction emerges when you recognize that an end described by those laws is not an end of the universe. It is only an end of certain processes within it. Even a universe approaching maximal uniformity, where differences vanish and no work can be extracted, is still a universe described over time. It still has states. It still allows comparison. Calling this an ending satisfies intuition, but it does not terminate the structure that makes description possible. This is where the familiar answers begin to fail. You want the universe to end the way systems end, by running out of usable energy or collapsing under gravity. But these outcomes are not final in the way intuition demands. They are asymptotic. They describe trends, not conclusions. They tell you how behavior changes, not how reality stops. The universe does not promise a final frame where everything resolves. The deeper mechanism becomes visible when you abandon the idea that the universe is heading toward a destination. The universe is not moving toward an end state the way a process moves toward completion. Its large-scale behavior is governed by geometry and constraint, not intention or narrative. Expansion does not imply purpose. Cooling does not imply exhaustion. These are descriptions of relations changing under fixed rules, not steps in a story. At this point, intuition insists on a last refuge, that even if the universe does not end dramatically, it must at least end definitively. That there must be a point beyond which nothing meaningful occurs. But meaningful is not a physical criterion. It is a human one. The universe does not optimize for significance. It preserves consistency. Where consistency allows structure, structure persists. Where it does not, the language of persistence fails. The contradiction sharpens further. You assume the universe must have a future in the same way it had a past. But the past and future are not symmetric features guaranteed by structure. They emerge from conditions. The universe began in a highly ordered state that allowed an arrow of time to exist. That arrow may weaken, it may dissolve, but its dissolution is not an event. It is the loss of a distinction. The universe does not notice this loss. Only observers do. This reframes the question entirely. The universe does not end in the way intuition expects. It does not reach a final chapter. It does not stop existing because existence is not a process that consumes itself. What changes are the conditions under which change can be described. When those conditions fade, so does the relevance of your question. The unavoidable conclusion begins to take shape without spectacle. The universe will not end as a dramatic event that occurs in time. It will approach conditions where time, structure, and distinction no longer function in the ways required for endings to be defined. The question of how it ends dissolves not because it is unanswered, but because the framework that made it sensible no longer applies. Once this is understood, the fear attached to cosmic endings shifts. It is no longer about destruction or collapse. It is about recognizing that reality does not guarantee closure. The universe does not conclude for your benefit. It remains consistent with itself, even when that consistency no longer supports the categories you rely on to make sense of it. If an ending requires time, sequence, and comparison to exist at all, what exactly are you assuming must still be present when you imagine the universe finally ending? The first realization unsettles, but intuition does not release its grip. Even after accepting that the universe may not end as a dramatic event, you may still believe that it must terminate in a definable condition, a final configuration that can be named, described, and understood as the outcome of everything that came before. This belief survives because it preserves the idea that reality must eventually settle. The universe does not share this requirement. Discomfort deepens when you recognize that the most common endings offered, cooling into uniformity, thinning into emptiness, dissolving into equilibrium, are not endings at all. They are descriptions of behavior extended indefinitely. They rely on time continuing to function, on comparison between earlier and later states, on the persistence of distinction, however faint. An ending that still permits earlier and later has not ended anything fundamental. It has merely disappointed expectation. Here the contradiction becomes explicit. You want the universe to end because you believe processes must complete. Yet completion is a concept that applies only to systems operating within time toward a goal. The universe has no goal. It does not progress toward resolution. It does not exhaust itself by existing. The idea that it must eventually stop behaving is a projection of human experience, not a structural demand. You may attempt to rescue this intuition by appealing to inevitability. Expansion will continue. Energy gradients will flatten, structures will decay, nothing complex will remain. This sounds final, but inevitability is not finality. These outcomes describe how certain differences diminish, not how reality ceases. A universe with no usable gradients is still a universe. A universe without observers is still a universe. The absence of activity meaningful to you does not constitute an ending to the structure itself. The deeper mechanism reveals itself when you notice what all intuitive endings have in common. They assume that time remains a valid dimension all the way to the end. That states can still be ordered, that existence can still be tracked, but time itself is not guaranteed to persist as a meaningful ordering principle indefinitely. The arrow of time depends on conditions. Those conditions can fade. When they do, the distinction between past and future weakens, then dissolves. This is not an event in time. It is the loss of time's asymmetry. This realization dismantles another assumption. You expect the universe to end because it began. You imagine symmetry, a starting point mirrored by a finishing point. But beginnings and endings are not symmetrical features of reality. The beginning was a boundary where time became defined. An ending, if it occurs, would be a boundary where time ceases to function as such. These are not opposite moments. They are limits of applicability. The universe does not promise a narrative arc with matching bookends. At this depth, the idea of a final answer becomes suspect. Answers presuppose stable questions, but the question of how the universe will end assumes that will, how, and end remain meaningful indefinitely. The universe does not commit to preserving these terms. It preserves only internal coherence. Where coherence no longer supports temporal distinction, the language of outcome collapses. This is why the most honest descriptions of the universe's fate sound unsatisfying. They do not offer closure. They do not culminate in a definitive scene. They describe trends that lose relevance rather than events that conclude. The universe does not arrive at an ending. It approaches conditions under which arrival no longer applies. The contradiction sharpens further when you consider that an ending, as you imagine it, requires an observer to recognize it as such. Recognition is a temporal act. It requires memory, comparison, anticipation. If the universe reaches conditions where these are no longer supported, there is no perspective from which an ending could be said to occur. The universe does not witness its own conclusion. Witnessing is already too much to assume. The unavoidable conclusion begins to tighten. The universe will not end in a way that satisfies the demand for finality. It will not conclude with a definitive state that can be labeled as the last. It will instead evolve toward conditions where the distinctions required to define endings, change, sequence, comparison, lose their footing. The question of how it ends does not fail because the answer is hidden. It fails because the structure that made the question meaningful does not persist indefinitely. This is not a denial of physics. It is a consequence of taking physics seriously without importing narrative expectations. The universe does not owe you an ending that feels complete. It owes only consistency. When consistency no longer includes the categories you rely on, those categories disappear without ceremony. If an ending requires a perspective that can recognize it as an ending, how certain are you that the universe is structured to preserve that perspective all the way to the limit you imagine? The remaining resistance now takes its most refined form. Even after accepting that the universe may not end as an event or a final state, you may still believe that it must at least approach an ultimate condition that can be treated as an answer. Something asymptotic, stable, and definitive. This belief feels restrained, almost scientific, yet it still carries the same hidden demand that reality must resolve into a form that can be understood as complete. Discomfort intensifies when you realize that stability itself is a temporal notion. A stable condition is one that persists across time without significant change. Persistence already assumes duration. If the universe reaches conditions where time no longer functions as an ordering principle in the way you expect, then stability cannot be defined. There is no interval across which persistence could be measured. The idea of an ultimate condition dissolves along with the clock that would confirm it. This exposes a deeper contradiction. You have been assuming that explanation culminates in description, that the universe must eventually settle into something that can be pointed to and named. But naming requires distinction. Distinction requires comparison. Comparison requires time. When the conditions that support these operations weaken, explanation does not arrive at a final object. It loses the ability to conclude. The deeper mechanism becomes unavoidable here. The universe is not a process running toward termination. It is a structure governed by constraints that do not privilege beginnings or endings. Expansion, dilution, and decay are not steps toward a conclusion. They are changes in relational properties under fixed rules. As those relations flatten, the arrow of time weakens. When the arrow weakens, the very sense of toward dissolves. Without toward, the concept of an end becomes meaningless. This is why even the most extreme futures described by cosmology fail to deliver finality. Whether the universe expands indefinitely or approaches a uniform state, these descriptions remain embedded in time. They assume a future that continues to be definable. But the conditions that allow such definability are not guaranteed. The universe does not promise that its own description will remain valid forever. Another intuition collapses here. You believe that because the universe began in an ordered state, it must conclude in a disordered one. You imagine symmetry between origin and fate, but symmetry is not required. The beginning marked the emergence of time as a usable dimension. A potential ending would mark its erosion. These are not mirror images. They are distinct boundaries of applicability. The universe does not complete a loop. It exhausts a distinction. At this point, the idea of a final answer reveals its limitation. An answer implies closure. Closure implies a question that remains meaningful until the end, but the question of how the universe ends depends on time continuing to function as a framework for comparison. If that framework degrades, the question loses coherence before it can be answered in the way you expect. This is the point where intuition finally fails without replacement. There is no hidden fate waiting to be uncovered that will feel satisfying. There is no ultimate condition that resolves everything into clarity. The universe does not offer a last scene. It offers a gradual loss of the conditions that make scenes possible. The unavoidable conclusion approaches with precision. The universe will not end in a way that can be cleanly described as an outcome. It will approach conditions where the distinctions required for outcomes, change, sequence, direction, cease to function. At that boundary, the universe does not stop. It simply no longer supports the language of stopping. This is unsettling because it denies you closure. It denies the comfort of knowing how it all finishes. But the denial is not arbitrary. It follows directly from taking the structure of time seriously rather than intuitively. The universe does not fail to provide an ending. It reveals that endings were never guaranteed. If the universe exhausts the conditions that make conclusions meaningful, what exactly are you expecting a final answer about its fate to look like? What remains now is not another hypothesis, but the collapse of the expectation that reality must culminate in a statement you can keep. You may accept that the universe does not end as an event, not as a state, not even as an asymptote that can be meaningfully confirmed. Yet a final demand persists, that whatever happens must still be capturable by description, that there must be something left to say at the end. This demand is not imposed by physics, it is imposed by the need for closure. Discomfort sharpens when you recognize that closure is not a property of the universe. It is a property of narratives constructed within time. Narratives require beginnings, middles, and ends. They require progression and resolution. The universe does not require any of these. It is a structure defined by relations that remain consistent as long as the relations can be defined. When the relations that support time weaken, narrative does not conclude. It becomes irrelevant. This forces a final contradiction into view. You have been asking how the universe will end, as if the universe were obliged to preserve the language in which the question is asked. But questions are tools. They operate within domains. When the domain changes, the tools do not follow. The universe does not fail to answer because it withholds information. It fails to answer because the terms of the question no longer apply. The deeper mechanism resolves this contradiction without offering comfort. The universe is not heading toward an ending because it is not heading anywhere. Direction is supplied by the arrow of time, and the arrow of time is a condition, not a law. It exists where differences can be ordered. It weakens where differences flatten. When it dissolves, there is no toward, no after, no finally. The universe does not arrive at a fate. It loses the capacity for arrival to be defined. This is why the most faithful descriptions of the universe's far future feel empty rather than final. They do not climax. They thin out. They do not announce completion. They remove the scaffolding that allowed completion to be recognized. What disappears is not reality, but the framework that allowed reality to be experienced as a sequence of changes moving toward an outcome. At this depth, even the word will becomes suspect. Will assumes a future that can be compared to a present. Comparison assumes time retains its ordering power. There is no guarantee of this. The universe does not promise to carry your grammatical structures indefinitely. It preserves only internal consistency. Where that consistency no longer supports temporal comparison, the future ceases to be a meaningful category. This is the final displacement of intuition. You began by imagining an ending because you live inside time. You conclude by recognizing that time is not owed permanence. The universe can remain coherent while withdrawing the conditions that make endings intelligible. Nothing breaks, nothing resolves, nothing concludes. The universe does not finish. It simply no longer permits the question to be asked in the way you insist. This is what makes the answer unsettling rather than dramatic. There is no catastrophe to fear and no silence to imagine. There is only the recognition that the universe does not need to end in order to be complete. Completion was never its obligation. Consistency was. Where consistency remains without time, the universe remains without endings. The unavoidable conclusion stands without flourish. The universe will not end as a final moment you could point to because moments are not guaranteed forever. It will approach conditions where the distinctions required for endings, before and after, change and persistence, expectation and fulfillment, lose their footing. At that boundary, the universe does not provide closure. It removes the need for it. If the universe can remain fully coherent without ever providing an ending that can be recognized as such, what does that reveal about your belief that reality must eventually resolve into something you can call the end? What remains now is not speculation, but inevitability. After dismantling every image of an ending you can imagine, there is only one conclusion left, and it is the one intuition resists most strongly. The universe does not require an ending in order to be complete. Completion was never part of its structure. That requirement came from you. The final discomfort arises when you realize that the demand for an ending is inseparable from the demand for meaning as you experience it. Meaning, to you, depends on sequence, on anticipation followed by resolution, on a future that closes what the past opened. This dependence feels natural because you exist inside time. But the universe is not obligated to preserve the conditions that make meaning feel structured in this way. It does not collapse when those conditions fade. Only your expectations do. The contradiction is now unavoidable. You have treated the universe as if it must answer the same kinds of questions that events inside it answer. How did it begin? How will it end? What comes after? But the universe is not an event within a larger framework. It is the framework. Applying internal questions to the framework itself does not extend understanding, it misapplies it. At the deepest level, the universe does not approach its end. Approaching is a temporal relation. It does not run out of time. Running out implies a resource being consumed. Time is not a fuel the universe burns. It is a condition that exists only where the structure of space-time allows ordering. When that allowance weakens, time does not fail. It becomes irrelevant. This is the final mechanism intuition cannot absorb. Reality does not disappear when time ceases to function. It does not transition into nothingness. Nothingness was never the alternative. What disappears is the ordering principle that allowed reality to be described as a progression of moments. The universe does not end in darkness or silence. Darkness and silence are contrasts that require time. Without time, there is no contrast to preserve. This is why the most honest answer about how the universe will end sounds unsatisfying. There is no final image, no ultimate condition that can be held in the mind, no last moment to imagine. The universe does not offer an ending you can picture because picturing relies on temporal structure. When that structure no longer applies, imagination reaches its limit without being replaced. The terror implied in this answer is not emotional. It is cognitive. It is the realization that reality does not guarantee accessibility to human understanding at every scale and every era. The universe remains consistent even when it abandons the features that make consistency narratable. It does not preserve time so that conclusions can be drawn. It preserves only coherence. The unavoidable conclusion stands without consolation. The universe will not end in a way that can be experienced, recorded, or recognized as an ending. It will move toward conditions where the language of ending no longer applies. Not because reality dissolves, but because the framework that allowed dissolution to be defined no longer exists. The universe does not conclude, it outgrows the question. If the universe can remain fully coherent without ever providing a final moment you can recognize as the end, which part of your belief about reality was actually dependent on time continuing forever?